The autumn of 1817 arrived at Farknall not as a season of mellow fruitfulness, but as a creditor. It seeped through the ill-fitting window frames with a damp chill and painted the surrounding woods in shades of rust and decay. The house itself seemed to be shrinking from the cold, its grey stone darkened by perpetual moisture, its chimneys breathing only thin, hesitant plumes of smoke. Farknall had once been a proud, solid home. Now it was a house of economies, of mended linens and watered wine, a house holding its breath against the inevitable. Inside its walls, life was measured in subtractions. Fewer logs for the fire, fewer candles in the sconces, fewer pleasantries at the dinner table. For Louisa Holt, it was a state of being she had long grown accustomed to. At 24, she was the elder daughter, the practical one, the one who knew precisely how many days the remaining flour would last, and which floorboards to avoid on the main stair. She moved through the house not as its mistress, but as its quiet caretaker, its silent witness. Her beauty, like the house, was of a subdued and unfashionable sort. Where her younger sister Henriette was all vibrant colour and dazzling light, a confection of blonde curls and brilliant blue eyes, Louisa was muted tones. Her hair was the deep brown of wet earth, her eyes a shifting hazel green, and her gowns were the soft greys and lavenders of twilight. They were gowns that had once belonged to her mother, cleverly refitted by her own hand. Henriette called them mouse colours. Louisa thought of them as the colours of survival. The morning the letter arrived was no different from any other. A sharp wind rattled the panes of the breakfast room. Her father, Sir Alistair Holt, sat staring into his empty teacup, as if searching for a future in the dregs. Her mother fluttered nervously, rearranging the few pieces of toast on the platter, while Henriette, radiant even in a state of peevish boredom, tapped a perfectly manicured finger against the damask tablecloth. "It is simply too dreary," Henriette announced to no one in particular. "Another day of this endless rain. If we do not get to London for the season, I shall positively wither away." Sir Alistair flinched. The London season was a fantasy, a ghost of a life they could no longer afford. Every mention of it was another turn of the screw. It was then that the butler, old Thomas, entered, his gait slower than ever. He carried a single letter on a silver tray that had not been polished in a month. He presented it to Sir Alistair. The breaking of the seal was a sound unnaturally loud in the tense quiet. Sir Alistair's eyes scanned the page. His face, usually a mask of weary defeat, underwent a strange transformation. A flicker of disbelief, a flush of high colour, then a look so close to hope it was terrifying. "My word," he breathed. He looked up, his gaze unfocused, as if seeing them all for the first time. "My word." "Father? What is it?" his wife asked, her voice trembling. "Velmore," he said, the name a strange, foreign object in the room. "The Duke of Velmore." Henriette sat up straight. The boredom fell away from her like a dropped cloak. The Duke of Velmore was a name of almost mythical power. Unmarried, impossibly wealthy, and reclusive to the point of legend. He owned vast tracts of the north, mines that bled silver, and a title that dripped history. "What about him?" Henriette demanded, her voice sharp with sudden, keen interest. Sir Alistair read from the letter, his voice shaking. "His Grace's man of business proposes a contract to settle all outstanding debts." He swallowed hard. "In exchange for a marriage. To my daughter." The room fell silent. Louisa felt the air grow thin. A marriage, a transaction, a daughter for a pile of gold. Henriette let out a little laugh, a sound of pure, unadulterated triumph. "Well," she said, smoothing her gown, "it seems my prayers have been answered. A duke." She looked at her reflection in the back of a silver spoon, tilting her head. "The Duchess of Velmore. It has a certain ring to it, does it not?" It was so completely assumed, so utterly taken for granted, that the Duke's offer could be for anyone but her. Louisa felt nothing. A strange, cold calm settled over her. Of course it was for Henriette. It was always for Henriette. The world was arranged for girls like Henriette. Louisa was merely part of the scenery. "He will arrive in 2 days' time," Sir Alistair said, his voice giddy. "To finalize the arrangements. We must prepare. We must make the house presentable." The next 48 hours were a flurry of panicked activity. Servants scurried to beat rugs and polish silver that had not seen the light in years. Louisa found herself directing it all. Her quiet competence, the only thing standing between the family's aspirations and utter chaos. She organized the menus, aired the linens for the guest suite, and instructed the gardener on which of the wilting flowers to cut for the vases. Through it all, Henriette drifted about, issuing contradictory orders and complaining about the shabbiness of everything, already practicing the airs of a duchess. Louisa did not begrudge her. She did not feel envy. What she felt was a profound weariness, the weight of a life spent being useful but never seen. She was the sturdy scaffolding that allowed the beautiful facade to stand. Soon, the scaffolding would no longer be needed. And what would become of her then? A spinster aunt, living on the charity of her sister's ducal husband. It was a bleak picture. She pushed it away. There was work to be done. 200 miles away, Jonathan, the 6th Duke of Velmore, stood in his solicitor's office in London and felt the walls closing in. The letter from Sir Alistair Holt, a fawning, near-hysterical acceptance, lay on the desk between them. "It is done, Your Grace," Mr. Atherton said, his tone carefully neutral. "The preliminary contract is accepted. Sir Alistair will be a solvent man, and you will have your dowry." Jonathan did not look at him. He stared out the window at the grey London street. The dowry. £20,000. A fortune. And it would be a mere drop in the bucket. Enough to pay the men at the Tynedale mine for another 6 months. Enough to shore up the most pressing debts. Enough to buy him a little more time before the great gilded house of Velmore collapsed into a pile of rubble. His father, the 5th Duke, had been a man of grand appetites and foolish investments. The son had inherited the title, the lands, the history, and the rot beneath it all. Jonathan had spent the last 5 years since his father's death in a silent, desperate battle to hold it all together. He had sold off properties, curtailed every expense, and worked like a common clerk, earning him the reputation of a cold, miserly recluse. He did not care. All he cared about was saving his legacy, saving the livelihoods of the thousands of tenants and workers who depended on the estate. This marriage was the final, most desperate gamble. A baronet's daughter from a down-at-heel family in the middle of nowhere. Mr. Atherton had found them. Sir Alistair Holt was drowning in debt, and he had a daughter of marriageable age. A Miss Holt. The dowry was her inheritance from a maternal grandmother, tied up so her father could not touch it. Until she married. Jonathan despised it. He despised the necessity, the transaction. He despised the idea of this girl, this Miss Holt. In his mind, she was already a caricature, a grasping, ambitious country miss, her head filled with dreams of a coronet, pushed forward by a desperate father. She would be simpering. She would be cunning. She and her family would descend upon him like vultures. "They will be expecting me on Friday," Jonathan said, his voice flat. "Indeed, Your Grace. Your carriage is arranged." "Cancel it." Mr. Atherton blinked. "Your Grace? I will travel alone, on horseback. I will arrive on Thursday, a day early." He turned from the window, and his grey eyes were hard as granite. "I will not be announced. I want to see this family as they are, not as they wish to appear." The solicitor looked alarmed. "Your Grace, that is highly unorthodox. To what end?" "To the end of truth, Atherton," the Duke said sharply. "I am about to sell my name and my future. I will not do it blind. I will see for myself what manner of trap I am walking into." And so, late on a drizzly Thursday afternoon, it was not a grand ducal carriage that rolled up the drive to Farknowle, but a lone rider on a powerful black horse. He was dressed not in the fine wools of a duke, but in the sturdy, plain garb of a travelling man. His coat was splattered with mud, his boots worn. He looked more like a groom looking for work than a peer of the realm come to claim a bride. He did not approach the front door. He circled around to the back, towards the stables, leading his horse. The air smelled of wet leaves and horse manure. A boy ran out, eyes wide at the sight of the magnificent animal. "Take him," Jonathan said, his voice a low command. "Rub him down and give him a good feed. I am here on business for the Duke." The boy nodded, intimidated. Jonathan moved away from the stables, keeping to the shadows of a yew hedge. He had no clear plan. He meant only to observe, to listen. The house was a flurry of activity, lights moving in the windows. He could hear raised voices, the clatter of pans. They were clearly preparing for his formal arrival tomorrow. He found himself near a small, walled garden, overgrown but for a few hardy rose bushes that still clung to their last fading blooms. Through the tangled branches, he could see a stone bench, and on it 2 figures. The Holt sisters, he presumed. He drew closer, melting into the deep shadow of an old oak. The light was failing, but he could make them out. One was a vision, a golden-haired girl, gesturing dramatically, her voice carrying on the damp air. The other was a still, quiet shape beside her. "It is an outrage," the blonde one, Henriette it must be, was saying. "To be stuck here for one more night. He should have been here today. I've been ready for hours. Do you have any idea how difficult it is to hold a state of perfect radiance for an entire afternoon?" The other girl said nothing. "And this dress?" Henriette plucked at her sleeve. "Mamma says I must wear it tonight. It is 3 years out of fashion. The Duke will think us paupers." "We are paupers, Henriette," the other girl said. Her voice was low and clear, with no trace of self-pity. It was a simple statement of fact. Henriette scoffed. "We will not be for long. Once I am Duchess, I shall have everything. A house in Mayfair, a box at the opera, all the jewels I can wear. I shall burn this entire wardrobe. I shall never wear lavender again." Jonathan felt a grim satisfaction. This was exactly what he had expected. Vapid, greedy, and utterly self-absorbed. This was the girl he was to marry. A bitter taste rose in his throat. "You should be happy for me, Louisa," Henriette went on, a tone turning petulant. "You have no idea the sacrifice I am making. Tying myself to some dreary old duke I have never even met." Louisa. So the quiet one was Louisa. "He is said to be very wealthy," Louisa murmured. "He had better be," Henriette snapped. "It is the only thing that could make him tolerable. They say he is as cold as a tomb and as silent as a stone. Probably ancient and wrinkled, too. But father's debts will be paid, and I shall be a duchess. You will come and live with me, of course. You can be my companion. You are so good at being quiet." The intended kindness was the cruelest cut of all. Jonathan found himself watching the silent figure of Louisa. She did not react. She simply sat, her hands folded in her lap, a study in stillness. Then Henriette leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "But I will tell you a secret, Lou. Once I am settled, and the Duke has served his purpose, there is always Lord Ashworth. He has always admired me. He's far more handsome. A duchess can have her little secrets, can she not?" Jonathan felt a muscle in his jaw tighten. This was beyond what he had imagined, not just greedy, but calculating and faithless before the bargain was even struck. He was not just buying a wife, he was buying a future betrayal. He had heard enough. He was about to turn, to leave, to ride back to London, and let the entire edifice of his heritage crumble, rather than chain himself to this viper. But then the quiet sister spoke. "You should not speak so," Louisa said, and her voice, though still low, had a new note in it. Not of judgment, of weariness. "You are building a house on sand, Henriette. A title and a fortune are not a home. Kindness is a home. Honesty is a home. You cannot buy those things." Henriette laughed, a brittle, mocking sound. "Oh, Louisa, you and your little sermons. That is why you are the one in grey, and I am the one who will be a duchess. Kindness does not pay the butcher, and honesty will not buy a new gown. You are a fool." She stood up, shaking out her skirts. "I am going inside. It is damp out here, and my hair will frizz. Do not be long. You are needed to help me dress for dinner." She swept away, a whirlwind of pink silk and self-importance, leaving her sister alone on the bench. Jonathan remained frozen in the shadows. He watched Louisa. She did not move for a long time. She did not cry. She had learned a long time ago that tears were exactly what Henriette wanted. She simply sat, her shoulders slumped just so, the perfect picture of quiet defeat. He saw her lift a hand and gently touch one of the fading roses on the bush beside her, her fingers tracing the delicate, wilting petals. And in that moment, something shifted in the Duke of Velmore. The shock he had anticipated was not what he had received. He had come expecting to find a schemer, and had found one. But he had also found something else, something he had not factored into any of his cold calculations. He had found the woman her sister had just called a fool, the one who spoke of kindness and honesty, the one who sat in the twilight in a faded grey dress, shouldering the casual cruelty of her family, with a dignity that was more profound than any ducal coronet. He looked at the contract in his mind's eye. It specified a marriage to Miss Holt. It did not say which one. Sir Alistair had 2 daughters, 2 Mrs. Holt. He had come to Farknowle to unmask a schemer. He had. But in doing so, he had accidentally stumbled upon a woman of substance in a house of straw. He did not look guilty. That was what she noticed most sharply. He simply looked resolved. He had made a choice. And Jonathan, Duke of Velmore, was not a man to be swayed from a choice once made. A slow, cold anger began to build in him. An anger not at the father, or even at the vapid, cruel younger sister. It was an anger at the injustice of it all, at a world that would reward a Henriette and overlook a Louisa. He had a choice, and for the first time in a very long time, the Duke of Velmore felt something other than the crushing weight of his obligations. He felt a flicker of purpose. He would honor the contract. He would pay the debts. He would marry Miss Holt. But he would be damned if it was the one they expected. The next morning, the household was in a state of high anxiety. The Duke was expected at noon. Henrietta had been awake since dawn, attended by her mother and a flustered maid. Louisa had been up even earlier, ensuring the breakfast was laid, the fires were lit, and the thin veneer of respectability was stretched as tightly as it would go over the cracks of Farknall. At precisely 12 o'clock, the sound of a carriage was heard on the gravel drive. Not a grand ducal carriage, but a smart, serviceable travelling coach drawn by 4 matched greys. The family assembled in the hall. Sir Alistair was sweating in his best coat. Lady Holt wrung her hands. Henriette stood slightly in front of them all, a vision in pale blue, her expression a perfect blend of maidenly modesty and aristocratic welcome. Louisa stood behind them, near the door, a grey shadow ready to retreat as soon as she was no longer needed. Thomas opened the door. A footman jumped down and lowered the steps. And out stepped the Duke of Velmore. He was not ancient. He was not wrinkled. He was tall, dressed in the impeccable, severe black of a man who needs no colour to command attention. His dark hair was unadorned, his jaw was sharp, and his eyes, a startling, stormy grey, swept over the assembled family with an unnerving lack of expression. He was handsome in a way that was more intimidating than pleasing. Sir Alistair bustled forward, hand outstretched. Your Grace, welcome, welcome to Farknall. We are deeply honoured. The Duke inclined his head, his gaze passing over Sir Alistair, over Lady Holt, and resting for a fraction of a second too long on Henriette. He saw the practised smile, the avarice glittering in her eyes. He saw everything he had heard in the garden the night before. Then his eyes moved past her. They found Louisa standing in the shadows by the door. Their eyes met. For 1 second, 2 seconds, 3. She saw a flicker of something in their grey depths. Recognition. It made no sense. She had never seen this man before in her life. Yet he looked at her as if he knew her. He broke the gaze and turned back to Sir Alistair. Sir Alistair, he said, his voice a low baritone that seemed to vibrate in the very flagstones. I have reviewed the terms of our agreement. Excellent, excellent, her father boomed, his relief palpable. My daughter, Henriette, is overjoyed to make your acquaintance. He gestured grandly. Henriette performed a flawless curtsy, her smile dazzling. Your Grace, it is a pleasure to welcome you. The Duke did not smile. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. The almost. His gaze was fixed on her, cold and assessing. Indeed, he said softly. Then he did the most shocking thing. He took a step forward, moving directly past the stunned Henriette, and stopped in front of Louisa. The entire hall held its breath. He stood before her, a towering, dark figure. She had to tilt her head back to meet his eyes. She felt the force of his presence like a physical blow. She could smell the scent of rain and leather and cold, clean air. "You are Miss Louisa Holt," he stated. It was not a question. She found her voice, though it was little more than a whisper. "I am, Your Grace." He gave a slight, formal bow. "The contract?" he said, his voice clear and carrying to every corner of the silent hall, "is for your hand in marriage." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a dense, heavy thing, broken only when Henriette made a small, choking sound. Sir Alistair's jaw dropped. "Your Grace, there must be some mistake. The contract. My daughter." "The contract specifies a marriage to Miss Holt," the Duke said, his eyes never leaving Louisa's face. "You have 2 daughters. I am choosing the elder." He held out his hand. It was a gesture of command, an undeniable summons. Louisa stared at the gloved hand suspended in the air between them. Her mind was a whirlwind. Why? Why her? This made no sense. It was a mistake, a cruel joke. But the look in his eyes was not a joke. It was serious, deadly serious. Henrietta finally found her voice. "No!" The word was a shriek. "It was meant for me. He wants me. Father, tell him." "Your Grace, my daughter Henriette is the beauty of the county," Lady Holt pleaded, rushing forward. Louisa is a good, quiet girl. But Henriette..." The Duke's expression did not change. He simply waited. His hand remained outstretched. It was a test, a choice. He was offering her a way out of the shadows. But what was she walking into? A gilded cage? A life with this cold, unreadable man? She looked at her family. She saw the shock and fury on Henriette's face, the craven panic on her father's, the weeping confusion on her mother's. They were not looking at her. They were looking at the prize that had just been snatched away. For the first time, she saw them clearly. She had been a tool, a prop, a functionary in their lives. And now she was an obstacle. She looked back at the Duke. He was still waiting. His grey eyes held a question. "What will you do?" And in that moment, Louisa Holt made a choice. Not for the money, not for the title, but for herself. She was so tired of being invisible. This man, for whatever reason, saw her. Slowly, deliberately, she lifted her chin. She put her small, work-roughened hand into his. His fingers closed around hers, strong and warm. "I accept, Your Grace," she said, her voice quiet but firm. And the world tilted on its axis. The days that followed were a blur of bewildered chaos. Henriette had retired to her room in a storm of hysterics, her sobs and accusations echoing through the house. Sir Alistair and Lady Holt moved about in a daze, torn between the relief of their salvation and the utter confusion of the Duke's choice. Louisa was the calm centre of the storm. The Duke was a man of swift, decisive action. Lawyers arrived, papers were signed, her dowry was transferred, her father's debts were settled. A wedding date was set for 1 week hence. A simple ceremony here at Farknall. The Duke remained at the local inn, but he came to the house each day. Their time together was formal, stilted. They walked in the garden. They sat in the parlour. He was impeccably polite. He asked her questions about flowers, about books, about the running of the estate. He listened to her answers with a quiet intensity that was unnerving. She learned things about him in slivers and fragments. She learned he did not like fuss. She learned he preferred silence to small talk. She learned that the staff at the inn were terrified of him, but that he had insisted on paying the stable boy himself for the good care of his horse. A small detail, but it stuck with her. She never asked him why he had chosen her. The question hung between them, a vast, unspoken thing. She was afraid of the answer, afraid it was pity, afraid it was a whim, afraid that if she poked at it, the entire fragile structure of her new reality would collapse. Her wedding dress was not a confection of silk and lace. The Duke's man of business had arranged for a modiste to be sent from York. She was a practical, no-nonsense woman who took Louisa's measurements and listened to her requests. "I want something simple," Louisa had said, "in a cream or a deep grey. Something I can wear again." The modiste had looked at her strangely. "A duchess can have any dress she desires, miss." "This duchess desires not to be wasteful," Louisa had replied. She chose a dress of heavy, dove-grey silk. It was exquisitely cut, falling in clean lines, with long sleeves and a high neck. When she put it on, it felt like armour. They were married on a crisp October morning in the small parish church. Her family stood stiffly on one side. The Duke stood alone on the other. He looked at her as she walked down the aisle, his expression unreadable. She said her vows in a clear, steady voice. He said his in a low rumble that made the air shiver. When he slid the plain gold band onto her finger, his touch was cool but firm. He was her husband. She was the Duchess of Velmore. It felt like a dream she was bound to wake from. After a brief, excruciatingly awkward wedding breakfast, they departed. Louisa did not look back as the carriage pulled away from Farknowle. She was leaving nothing behind but a life that no longer fit her. The journey to Blackwood Manor, the Duke's primary seat in the north, was made mostly in silence. Louisa looked out the window at the passing scenery, a patchwork of autumn golds and browns. Her husband sat across from her, reading a book. He did not seem to feel the silence was a thing that needed to be filled. For this she was grateful. Blackwood Manor was not like Farknowle. It was a vast, imposing structure of dark stone that seemed to have grown out of the forbidding landscape. It was magnificent, but it was not welcoming. It was a fortress, the staff lined up to greet them, headed by a formidable housekeeper, Mrs. Graves. They looked at Louisa with curious, guarded eyes. The unlikely Duchess, the plain grey bride. That first night, dinner was a trial. They sat at opposite ends of a dining table, so long they might as well have been in different rooms. The meal was served by silent, efficient footmen. The crystal glittered. The silver gleamed. The silence was immense. Louisa looked at her husband, a remote, handsome stranger at the far end of the table. "What have I done?" The question screamed in her mind. He looked up as if he had heard her. "Is the meal to your liking, Your Grace?" he asked, his tone formal. "It is excellent, thank you," she said. "But you must not call me Your Grace. My name is Louisa." He inclined his head. "And you must call me Jonathan." It was the first crack in the formal facade. A very small one. But it was a start. Later, Mrs. Graves showed her to her rooms. A suite of rooms, in fact. A beautiful sitting room, a dressing room, and a vast, cold bedroom, with a canopied bed big enough for 4 people. It was connected by a door to an adjoining suite. His, she presumed. The door was closed. She was alone, a duchess in a castle. And she had never felt more lonely in her life. She sat on the edge of the bed, the grey silk of her wedding dress pooling around her, and for the first time since the Duke had walked into her life, she allowed herself to feel the full, terrifying weight of it all. She did not cry, but the tears were there, a hard, cold knot behind her breastbone. She had escaped one cage only to find herself in another, infinitely grander one. The next morning, Louisa awoke with a new sense of resolve. She would not be a prisoner. She would not be a decorative object. If this was to be her life, she would make it her own. She rose early, and, instead of waiting to be attended, dressed herself in one of her simple Farknol gowns. She found her way down the labyrinthine corridors to the kitchens. The kitchen staff, already at work, stared in stunned silence as the new Duchess walked in. "Good morning," Louisa said with a calm smile. "I am Louisa. I hope we shall be friends." She looked at the formidable Mrs. Graves. "I would like to learn the house, Mrs. Graves. From the bottom up. Will you show me?" Mrs. Graves, who had served the cold, silent Velmore dukes for 30 years, was taken aback. But she saw the genuine inquiry in Louisa's eyes. She saw the lack of artifice. She nodded slowly. "As you wish, Your Grace." And so began Louisa's conquest of Blackwood Manor. It was a quiet, patient campaign. She learned the servants' names. She learned their duties. She inspected the larders, the still room, the laundry. She did not interfere, but she observed. She asked intelligent questions. She learned that Mrs. Graves was in the kitchen every morning at 8, that the maid Agnes was curious but kind, that the gardener, Thomas, hardly ever spoke, but grew the most magnificent roses. She found the library, a vast 2-story room filled with thousands of books, all coated in a thin layer of dust. It was the heart of the house, but a heart that had stopped beating. She spent her afternoons there, organizing, dusting, opening the heavy curtains to let in the light. Jonathan watched her. He did not speak of it, but he watched. He would come home from his rides, or his long hours in his study, and find small changes. A bowl of late-blooming roses on a hall table, the scent of beeswax, where before there had been only dust. The sound of quiet, efficient activity, where before there had been only silence. One evening, he came to dinner to find the great, long table had been altered. The vast middle section had been removed, and the two ends brought together, so they now sat close enough to speak without shouting. A simple candelabra replaced the forest of silver. It was intimate. It was civilized. It was a home. Louisa watched him for a reaction. He paused at the door, taking it in. He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that was not assessment, not formality, but a flicker of something else. Surprise, and perhaps approval. He took his seat opposite her. "This is an improvement," he said simply. It was the highest praise he could have given. "We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel." The changes were small, but they accumulated. Louisa was a quiet presence, but a transformative one. She did not try to change him, only the space around him. She gave him room to be seen, and in the quiet spaces she created, Jonathan, Duke of Velmore, began to feel the thawing of a winter that had lasted for years. He found himself seeking her out. He would go to the library on the pretense of finding a book, and find himself staying, watching her as she sat by the fire, mending a tear in a household linen. She was always busy, her hands never idle. He began to talk to her, not about anything important, about the weather, about a horse that had thrown a shoe, about a passage in a book. She, in turn, began to see past the cold, ducal exterior. She saw the weariness in his eyes at the end of the day. She saw the way he worried at a stack of papers in his study, his brow furrowed. She knew he carried a great burden, though she did not know its nature. She only knew that he carried it alone. One evening, she brought him a cup of tea in his study. He was hunched over a large ledger, the candlelight throwing his sharp features into stark relief. He looked up, surprised. "You do not have to do that. There are servants." "I know," she said, placing the cup at his elbow. "But the servants are not your wife." She said it simply, a statement of fact. But the word, wife, hung in the air between them. He looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw not just the Duchess of Velmore, not just the quiet girl from Farknall, but Louisa, a woman of quiet strength and profound kindness, a woman who brought him tea, not out of duty, but out of care. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough. She nodded and turned to leave. "Louisa," he said, stopping her. "Stay, please." She turned back. He gestured to the chair opposite his desk. She sat. He did not speak for a long time, just stared into the fire. "The Tynedale mine has flooded again," he said at last, his voice flat. "The main pump has failed. It will cost a fortune to repair. A fortune I do not have." And just like that, the wall was down. He was telling her his secret, the great burden he carried. He told her everything. About his father's debts, the failing investments, the desperate struggle to keep the estate afloat. He told her about the marriage contract, the need for her dowry, the reason he had been forced to seek a bride. He did not tell her about his disguise. He did not tell her what he had overheard. He could not bring himself to speak of that shame. Louisa listened. She did not interrupt. She did not offer platitudes. She listened as he unburdened himself of years of solitary struggle. When he was finished, a heavy silence filled the room. "I am sorry," he said, his voice raw, "to have trapped you in this. It was not fair to you." She met his gaze across the desk. "You did not trap me, Your Grace. I walked into this with my eyes open. I chose this." "Jonathan," he corrected her, his voice barely a whisper. She took a breath. "You did not trap me. Jonathan." Saying his name felt momentous. It was a key turning in a lock. His eyes softened. The cold grey seemed to warm from within. "And you are not alone in this any more," she added quietly. "We are husband and wife. Your burdens are my burdens." He looked at her, at this woman who he had married for money, this woman he had plucked from obscurity, on a whim, an instinct. And he realized that in his desperate search for a solution to his financial ruin, he had accidentally found the one thing he had never known he needed. A partner, an ally, a friend. The move to London for the season was Jonathan's decision. He hated the city, but it was a necessary evil. Business had to be conducted, appearances maintained. The world could not know the Duke of Velmore was on the brink of ruin. For Louisa, London was a new and bewildering world. The noise, the crowds, the sheer scale of it was overwhelming. Their townhouse in Grosvenor Square was a palace of gilt and mirrors. But with Jonathan by her side, it was less intimidating. Their alliance, forged in the quiet of his study at Blackwood, had changed everything. They were a team. Society, however, was not so easily won over. The ton was abuzz with curiosity about the recluse Duke's new wife. The story of his choice had preceded them, the country mouse who had somehow trapped the lion. They stared at Louisa in her simple, elegant gowns, their eyes sharp with judgment. They whispered behind their fans. Louisa met their stares with quiet dignity. She was polite, she was poised, but she did not court them. She had her husband's respect. That was all that mattered. Jonathan was her shield. He stood by her side at every ball and soiree, his very presence a warning to the gossips. He was fiercely protective, a fact that did not go unnoticed. The cold, aloof Duke seemed to have been thawed by his plain little wife. It was a source of endless speculation. Then Henriette arrived. She appeared one afternoon in their drawing room, unannounced and uninvited, having attached herself to the party of a distant cousin. She was more beautiful than ever, dressed in the height of fashion. "Louisa, darling," she cried, rushing to embrace her. "And your Grace, I have come to see how you are getting on." Her eyes swept the room, taking in the opulent surroundings with a greedy gleam. She had come to claim what she believed was rightfully hers. Her campaign was subtle at first. She was all sweetness and light to Louisa's face, full of praise for her good fortune. But behind her back, she planted seeds of poison. She told tales of Louisa's plainness, her strangeness, her unsuitability. She hinted that Louisa must have used some trick, some form of blackmail, to trap the Duke. Poor Louisa, she would sigh to a circle of rapt listeners. She was always so odd, never interested in parties or gowns, always hiding in corners. It is a miracle the Duke even noticed her. One does wonder what hold she has over him. Louisa felt the chill in the air. Invitations became fewer. The whispers grew louder. She tried to ignore it, but it was like being slowly poisoned. Jonathan was furious. "I will send her away," he growled, after finding Louisa looking pale and strained after an afternoon of Henriette's visiting. "No," Louisa said, her voice firm. "That is what she wants. For you to act the tyrant. For me to act the victim. We will do neither. We will simply be." But Henriette was not content with whispers. She needed a public victory. She needed to humiliate Louisa and expose her as an unworthy usurper. And she knew just the place to do it. The Duke's great-aunt, Lady Mariella, was a doyenne of society. An invitation to her annual ball was the most coveted of the season. Lady Mariella was a formidable old woman, with eyes that missed nothing. She had watched the new Duke and Duchess with keen interest. She had invited them to tea, and had spent an hour talking to Louisa, not about fashion or gossip, but about Italian painters and the challenges of managing a large estate. At the end of the visit, she had patted Louisa's hand. "You'll do," she had said gruffly. "The boy needs a backbone in his life. He's chosen well." The ball was to be the pinnacle of the season, and Henriette, through sheer manipulative force of will, had secured an invitation. She had a new gown of shimmering gold. She had a plan. She had found what she believed was the perfect weapon. A young, handsome, and deeply indebted lieutenant who had once paid Louisa some mild attention back in the country. A few whispered promises, a hint of a paid gambling debt, and the lieutenant was hers to command. The night of the ball arrived. Louisa dressed with care. Jonathan had commissioned a new gown for her, without her knowledge. It was not grey. It was the deep, rich green of a forest moss, a colour that made her hazel eyes shine like jewels. It was simply cut, but the fabric was a heavy, lustrous velvet that fell in graceful folds. When she came down the stairs, Jonathan was waiting. He stopped breathing for a moment. "Louisa," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she could not name. "You are beautiful." It was the first time he had ever said it. It warmed her more than any fire. Lady Mariella's ballroom was a galaxy of glittering chandeliers and sparkling diamonds. The air was thick with perfume and gossip. When the Duke and Duchess of Velmoor were announced, a hush fell. All eyes were on them, on the cold Duke and his controversial bride. Louisa held her head high. With Jonathan's hand at her elbow, she felt she could face anything. They danced. For the first time, they moved together, not as two separate entities, but as one. His hand was firm at her waist. Her hand rested on his shoulder. They moved through the steps of the waltz, the rest of the world falling away. In the circle of his arms, she was safe. She was home. But the world did not stay away for long. Henriette was watching, her eyes narrowed. She chose her moment perfectly. During a lull in the music, as people stood in small groups, she approached, the young lieutenant in tow. Her voice, though pitched to sound concerned, carried through the room. "Oh, Louisa," she cried, loud enough for all to hear. "I am so glad to see you looking so well. And you too, Lieutenant Croft. How lovely to see old friends reunited here in London." The lieutenant, a callow youth with panicked eyes, gave a stiff bow. He looked at Louisa, then quickly away, a flush of shame on his cheeks. The implication was clear. A secret rendezvous. A past connection. The whispers started immediately. A rustle of silk and malice. Henriette pressed her advantage. "I was just telling the lieutenant how you used to walk out together. Do you remember, Louisa? Those long walks by the river. You were always so fond of him." It was a lie. A complete fabrication, built on the thinnest sliver of truth. He had once tried to flirt with her, and she had politely but firmly rebuffed him. But in this room, in this atmosphere of suspicion, the lie had wings. Louisa felt the blood drain from her face. All eyes were on her, judging, condemning. She felt the familiar chill of being misunderstood, of being cast as something she was not. She looked at Jonathan. His face was a mask of cold fury. His jaw was clenched, his eyes glacial. For a terrifying moment, she thought he believed it. She saw a flicker of doubt in his expression, and her heart broke. Henrietta saw it too. She smiled, a small, triumphant smile. This was her victory. She had driven a wedge between them. She had exposed the country mouse for the schemer she was. But she had underestimated Louisa, and she had profoundly underestimated the Duke. Louisa took a breath. She would not cry. She would not rage. She would be what she had always been, quiet, dignified, and honest. She turned to her sister, her gaze steady. "Henriette," she said, her voice not loud, but carrying a sudden authority that cut through the whispers. "You are mistaken. The lieutenant and I were barely acquainted. And you know that perfectly well." "Oh, Louisa, your memory must be failing," Henriette said with a tinkling, false laugh. "Why, I remember you writing his name in your journal." This was the final, fatal overreach. Before Louisa could even deny it, Jonathan stepped forward. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The cold fury emanating from him was enough to silence the entire room. He looked not at Louisa, but at Henriette. His grey eyes were not just cold now. They were lethal. "My wife does not lie," he said. The words were stones dropped into a frozen pool. "And she does not keep a journal. She is far too practical for such sentimentalities." He then turned his gaze on the trembling lieutenant. "Lieutenant Croft, a word of advice. When you choose to sell your honor, I suggest you ask for a higher price. The promissory note for your gambling debts, which I now hold, was for a paltry £500. Your reputation, it seems, is worth even less." He produced a folded piece of paper from his coat. The lieutenant turned a pasty white. A collective gasp went through the ballroom. Jonathan was not finished. He turned back to Henriette, who now stood frozen, the colour draining from her face. "And you, Miss Holt," he said, his voice laced with ice. "You speak of my wife's past. Perhaps we should speak of yours." He paused for 1 second. 2 seconds. The silence was deafening. I was at Farknol a day before I was expected. I was in the garden. I heard a rather interesting conversation about a certain Lord Ashworth, about a duchess's little secrets. Henriette looked as if he had struck her. She stared at him, her mouth open, a look of pure horror on her face. The truth of it, the memory of her own careless, cruel words, dawned on her. She had been overheard. She had been caught in her own trap. "I chose my wife, Miss Holt," Jonathan continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper, yet heard by everyone. "I chose her not for her beauty, though she is the most beautiful woman in this room. I chose her not for her connections, for she had none. I chose her for her character, for her honesty, for her kindness, for a quiet dignity you could not comprehend in 1,000 years." He turned to Louisa, his eyes no longer cold, but blazing with a fierce, protective love. He took her hand and raised it to his lips. "I chose her because she is the finest woman I have ever known," he declared to the silent, watching room. "She is my Duchess, and I would thank you all to remember that." It was done. The route was absolute. Henriette stood for a moment, exposed and defeated. The whispers now were not about Louisa. They were about her. She saw the scorn, the pity, the schadenfreude on the faces around her. With a choked sob, she turned and fled the ballroom. The antagonist's defeat was not entirely satisfying. It was also sad. Louisa looked at her sister's retreating back and felt a pang of pity for the girl who had been taught that her face was her only currency and had just discovered it was worthless. Lady Mariella came forward, tapping her cane. "Well," she said loudly, "that's that, then. The music seems to have stopped. Someone play a waltz, for heaven's sake. The Duke and his Duchess wish to dance." And as the music swelled, Jonathan turned to Louisa. He pulled her into his arms, into the center of the floor. "I'm sorry," he murmured, his lips against her hair. "I'm sorry you ever had to doubt." "I didn't," she whispered back, her heart so full she thought it might burst. "Not really." "I love you, Louisa," he said, the words he had never said, the words she had never dared to hope for. "I think I have from the moment I saw you on that bench, being brave in the dark." "And I love you, Jonathan," she replied, looking up at him, her eyes shining with tears she no longer had to hold back. They were not tears of sorrow, but of a joy so profound it was almost painful. They waltzed, and the entire world seemed to hold its breath, watching as the cold Duke and his quiet Duchess finally, truly found each other. Epilogue 1 year later. The autumn sunlight that slanted through the tall windows of the Blackwood Library was warm and golden. It illuminated the dust motes dancing in the air, and fell across a room that was utterly transformed. The books were organized, the brass polished, the furniture grouped into comfortable, inviting arrangements. The heart of the house was beating strong and steady. Louisa sat in a comfortable armchair by the fire, a book forgotten in her lap. She was watching her husband. Jonathan was on the floor, a place she never would have imagined seeing him a year ago, patiently showing a carved wooden bird to a small, gurgling baby with a fluff of dark hair and familiar, stormy, grey eyes. The Tynedale mine had not been lost. Louisa, with her practical mind and experience of making much from little, had spent hours poring over the estate accounts and maps with Jonathan. It was she who had noticed the old, forgotten drainage adit on a survey from the 17th century. It was her suggestion to clear and reopen it, a far cheaper solution than replacing the failed modern pump that had saved the mine, and, with it, the estate. Jonathan had called her his clever, practical duchess. The tenants just called her a miracle. Farknowle had been sold. Sir Alistair and Lady Holt had retired to a small cottage in Bath, where they lived in reduced but solvent circumstances. Henriette had married a wealthy merchant twice her age. It was said she had a fine house and many gowns, but that she never smiled. There was a soft footstep, and Mrs. Graves entered, carrying a tea tray. She smiled warmly at the domestic scene. The whole house was warmer now. It was full of life and laughter. It was a home. Jonathan looked up and caught Louisa's eye. He smiled. It was no longer an almost smile. It was a real, unguarded expression of pure happiness that reached his eyes and transformed his entire face. He had learned to smile since his son, Arthur, was born. He crawled over to her chair and rested his head on her knee, looking up at her. "What are you thinking about?" he asked softly. "I was thinking about a girl in a grey dress," she said, her fingers gently tracing the line of his jaw. "Sitting on a stone bench in a ruined garden." "I think about her all the time," he said. "I think about how lucky the man who found her was." "He wasn't lucky," Louisa corrected him gently. "He was just paying attention." He leaned up and kissed her, a slow, gentle kiss full of love and gratitude, and the quiet comfort of a shared life. A life that had begun as a cold transaction, but had become, through patience and kindness, and the courage to truly see another person, the grandest of love stories. The quiet dignity of a girl in grey had outlasted all the loud cruelty of the world, and brought them here, to this sunlit room, together. Thank you for listening to the story, all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from, and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.